I'm excited to talk to Caty and Brian, two of our vertical SaaS leaders, that's something at Bessemer to be a vertical SaaS leader because I think all of us have invested in one or two vertical SaaS companies at this point. It's kind of our stock in trade in many ways, but Caty and Brian are deep in it. Brian, you were one of the very OG vertical SaaS investors. In fact, did you make the first vertical software investment at Bessemer? Do you get
No,
credit for that?
that was Jeremy Levine.
Okay. But you were
I
there.
made the
You saw it
second.
happen. You saw it happen. So vertical SaaS and AI, be honest with me, when you saw AI emerge, like, did you immediately think vertical software, or did it take you a while to get there?
I immediately thought vertical software.
You're just
The
like,
hammer, everything's a nail.
changing technology. What will this do for laundromats? Was like your first reaction.
What's the expression? To hammer, everything's a nail?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
you did.
that's it. I'm a
You did very
vertical
well.
software hammer.
Um, so Caty, yeah, I feel like in the early days, meaning 12 seconds ago, maybe a year and a half ago, of this trend, there were a lot of questions of, okay, the applications of this language model technology to verticals, how big of an opportunity is that, right? And I think that was maybe a debate of ours 18 months ago. You showed me a piece of analysis that kind of blew my mind recently, that I wanted you could share with our, who the hell knows who's watching this, but audience. Like, how big do you think this could be? Like, do you have any early data, softball,
Yeah.
that's telling us
Yeah,
anything?
definitely. So the analysis that we ran that you're referencing, Bessemer has a really large vertical software portfolio and increasingly a vertical AI portfolio. And so we're lucky enough that we're in a position where some of our vertical software companies and vertical AI companies sell into the same customer base. And so we were curious to know how do ACVs compare? Are these vertical AI companies commanding real pricing power? Or are they kind of a nice to have little feature and at a much smaller scale than the traditional, core workflow ACVs that we see in our existing portfolio? And what we found when we looked at overlapping customers was that the vertical AI companies, despite being in their earlier stages of maturity, are already commanding pricing power of around 80% of the existing software ACVs. And so that said to us two things. One was, a lot of these vertical markets where we thought there's a core workflow software, and so you're sort of one and done in that regard. All of a sudden, these are open back up. And we think that there's now additional opportunity to invest in these. And 80% ACVs mean at a really basic level, these TAMs might be 2x the size.
Yeah.
And then secondly,
Well, and let me stop you and probe on it.
yeah,
So 80% of the ACVs, and for the most part, they're not selling the same product. It's like a different
Yeah, Ken, would
value
it be
proposition.
helpful if I just brought it to life?
Yeah,
Are we
do it.
allowed? We're allowed to talk about our portfolio companies,
Sure.
right? Okay, so the companies that Katie is referencing very diplomatically, one is a company called Litify. Litify makes system of record workflow software for personal injury law firms. They run their entire law firm on Litify, soup to nuts. Like, it doesn't get more mission critical
Core
vertical
business,
software,
they're big
core
time.
business
Yeah.
software, operating system for personal injury law firms. Katie has compared the price points, the average contract value per year of Litify against one of our fastest growing vertical AI companies, a company called Even Up. And what Even Up does is it sells a service to those personal injury law firms. It's not a software product, it's a service. And it essentially replaces the work that lawyers and paralegals are doing, drafting letters to insurance companies, asking those insurance companies to pay their client. Those letters are called demand letters. Even Up replaces the demand letter process and uses AI behind the scenes to get it done. And so, Katie, maybe you can elaborate on what we saw when we compared Litify to Even Up.
yeah,
Well, so
perfect.
it's the 80% number, and I know it's one of by the way, this isn't just that, right? There are several data points that went into this, but the order of magnitude that so showed the same thing, which is the law firms are paying as much for Even Up as they are for
And by
ACV.
the way, it's really surprising because Litify is the most important piece of software that
Right.
these companies use, and they're spending almost as much on this little kind of one-off service as they are on their core system of
And
record
so I know
software.
you know the answer to this, but like, why does that make sense? Like, why aren't they like balking it? Wait a minute, we can't double our technology budget in a year. Like, how do they think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a leading question, and the reason is because that they're really not. They're just replacing existing services spend, and so they don't need to create entirely net new budget. Instead, it's a reallocation of services spend to now something that is productized thanks to AI. And so we think that that speaks to the magnitude of the opportunity, because this is one unique pocket of services spend, but there's likely multiple others within legal, within every other vertical. And so all of a sudden you can have multiple core workflow like ACVs, and thus the TAM, in these early days, we see it doubling in a few of these instances, but it's likely just the beginning.
Yeah.
But another way, they're not comparing even to Litify and to software spend. They're comparing even up to the expensive labor they would need to hire to do the work
Or the
themselves.
value of the output of labor. Like I think in many cases you've told me like they're expanding their consumption. It's not like they've just purely displaced the volume of
That's right. That's right. They're not cutting heads. They're able to take on more work because they're no longer constrained by the labor that they have.
Right.
And so, the opportunity for founders is to look inside every single company in every vertical, every single customer, and figure out, is there an opportunity to replace work, to replace tasks with an AI-enabled service?
And that may contain in some ways the answer to the other thing that I think we were debating much more hotly a year, 2 years ago, whether the incumbents were going to rapidly respond and have these sort of models as well and have these extensions. And it turns out this is like a very different type of business and a different type of delivery. And I think you've highlighted like a couple different flavors that it can take. Maybe, Caty, to put you on the spot again, leading question, but like what are you seeing that are like the flavors of ice cream in these markets?
Yeah. So I think at a high level, we're seeing three business models that these companies are entailing. So the first is Copilots, and this was really like the first wave of vertical AI. So I'd say this time a year ago, like really the thing that we were seeing was verticalized Copilots. So we have a company Sixfold in our portfolio. They're a Copilot for insurance underwriters. It helps them parse all this data, better understand the risk profile. And so in that way, Copilots really turbocharge an existing worker and help them kind of gain efficiencies and superpowers in this way. The second one is agents. And so I'd say this is like really the wave that we're starting to see now, and tying to the multimodal portion of state of the cloud. Many of these are multimodal. They're voice agents, they're text agents, they're coding agents, et cetera. And those do the work of a person. So that's typically internal headcount. So a sales rep, someone picking up the phone, same day, does inbound call reception for professional services, for home services businesses. And then lastly, in the even up style, AI enabled services. So these are typically third party outsourced service spend that's now able to be productized thanks to AI. And so these are companies that are cropping up. They might be TPAs, they may be legal services, they may be broader just professional services. And they're able to tap into that services spend.
All right. So what would you say to somebody who says, well, that's not software? I mean, Brian, you just said that's not software. And so in our industry, that's kind of a bad word, right? That's not software. Like, that's not software. That's not a venture backable business. That's not going to be efficient. Like, what do we not know yet? Or what are we saying that tells us it is or isn't?
I would point to a few things. One, these businesses are growing really, really fast, just as fast as software businesses. And so historically,
in some ways, I would argue faster than some of the best software businesses we've seen.
Yeah, even up as
we cited 400% growth rate at scale of some early businesses here. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe taking a step back, if you think about the criticisms, let me outline the criticisms associated with software, with services businesses from a venture perspective, and then what's different about these AI-enabled services. So criticism number one, hard to grow really fast organically with a services business. Your product is undifferentiated and you're constrained by your ability to hire labor. These AI-enabled services businesses are growing really fast, most of them growing north of 100% a year because they have a differentiated product, they're better and cheaper, significantly better and cheaper than the traditional labor model, and they're not constrained by people because most of the work is getting done by LLMs and software. So that's criticism number one, mitigated. Criticism number two is they have low margins. They're not that profitable.
Services margin, you hear people talk about, right?
Yeah, 30, 40, maybe 50% gross margins, best case scenario. That's not what we're seeing with these AI-enabled services businesses. Um, Not only are they better and cheaper, but they're also able to deliver better and cheaper value to their customers at 60, 70 plus percent software-like gross margin.
To state
Um,
the obvious, the model costs, they all have model costs, and there was a little bit of a chatter around, how much were they a thin wrapper around a bunch of, just a bunch of model cost, but the model costs are a fraction of the cost basis.
Correct. It turns out that when you add workflow and know-how and go-to-market and customer success and last mile operations on top of the LLM, you can capture a ton of value. And so most of our AI-enabled services businesses are operating at 60+% gross margins, and those gross margins are only getting better. And then, finally, the complaint about services businesses is that they're kind of undifferentiated. You're just hiring people and then adding a markup. And it goes without saying that these AI-enabled services businesses are highly differentiated because you can't just use OpenAI and add some bodies. You need to build a lot of custom functionality, workflows, processes, expertise to deliver a service that is better and cheaper than the incumbents. So
So
they
how
look
worried
they look
should
a
we
little
be
different.
about? Okay, so let's say these are great software businesses in disguise. They look a little servicey, maybe on the front end, but they're software. I mean, they've got software margin, software growth, software defensibility. How worried are we about the incumbent software players who are often sitting right next to these opportunities? Like, are they going after this hard? Are there blind spots? Is it very by vertical? Like, what's your opinion?
Katie, you want to take that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do think, like, maybe this is a cop-out answer. I do think it's really varied. Like, I think that we're seeing these areas like even up where there's not really a perfectly situated incumbent. And so it's pretty greenfield from that perspective. I think for some of these other opportunities, especially like some of these co-pilots, it feels somewhat inevitable that, they may be acquired or the existing core workflow software will just integrate, this as a feature or otherwise. So I think that's like a big question for us when we look at a lot of these is like, what's the defensibility? Are they getting some type of proprietary data? Like, it's a lot of the same frameworks that we've always used to think about. Is this a standalone business with high barriers to entry and some type of competitive differentiation? And so it's hard to say
There's
broadly.
no bad answer. I think that's right. I will say, like, just
Yeah,
personally,
Ken, maybe the other framework I would encourage us to think about, if history is any indication, you could look at what happened 20 years ago when the software world was transitioning from on-premise to cloud. And you basically had a situation where um, the movie kind of played out differently in each vertical. And that's because the incumbents have the distribution advantage. They've got the customer relationships, they've got the brand, they've got the salespeople, they've got the capital and the resources. And so there's no reason why they can't deliver on AI enabled services, AI enabled software. Um, but it requires incredible execution prowess. And so if you looked at vertical software, there are plenty of examples of industries where the on premise incumbents were able to make the cloud transition and shut out the cloud entrants. They continued to dominate.
cases never made the cloud transition and are still the incumbents. I mean,
Yeah,
we know some verticals that
yeah,
are sitting pretty.
yeah. But then there are even more examples of situations where the incumbents were just too slow, too fat, too happy to be able to compete, and the new cloud entrants took share. And so I think it'll largely depend on the behavior of the incumbents.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just say for me, year and a half, 2 years ago, I was very nervous about SaaS incumbents in most verticals. And what's interesting about this moment is a lot of the new verticals that are opened up don't have a strong incumbent because maybe they were dominated by language heavy tasks that, formerly like made the value of the vertical less accessible to software, and now are open. But actually, like, in the past year, I think I've dropped that fear a lot. And because we're seeing so many examples like even up in Litify where you are addressing a need that's, it's in the same, you know, industry, but it's not in the same zip code. It's a standalone thing. It's delivered in a different way. It's delivered by a highly competent team doing something really specialized. And the incumbents are much more likely to partner, distribute together, potentially acquire at points, but less likely to compete. Is my gut. So on paper, it made sense. Like, oh wow, the incumbents are going to take all of this out, but we're just not seeing a lot of it happen. I think we're also not seeing a lot of direct competition where somebody takes a
That's
language
right.
model tech and uses it to go straight at an incumbent, which I think would generate a different response. Um, well, cool. All right. So what a year from now, I feel like my head is spinning every time we check back in on, vertical AI or AI in general. Things are changing really, really fast. What's on the horizon for you that you think is not as obvious? Are there any trends you're paying attention to or sort of threads you're talking on that you think are interesting that we could be talking about in a year in a bigger way? Or no, we're done.
Look, if we could predict the future, we wouldn't be venture capitalists, we'd be entrepreneurs.
Yeah, we're pretty good at predicting the present.
Yeah.
The future's harder.
I mean, I do think that this notion of AI technology used to replace work to deliver AI-enabled services is really powerful. I mean, your
Yep.
typical company, their number one expense is labor. Their number one constraint to growth is labor. You look at economic spend, we're spending 10 to 20 times more on humans than we are on software. And so if you can capture some of that human spend, that's a really powerful opportunity. And I think it'll take two forms. One is the even up style of a de novo venture backed company, a really talented entrepreneur identifies a workflow, automates it, and it's lightning in a bottle. I think we may also start to see traditional services businesses, BPOs, law firms, accounting firms, experts, adopt these types of technologies to drive automation inside of their business.
Yeah.
And you asked for a spicy take. I think the demise of professional services firms is a bit overblown. If anything, some of the value associated with AI may end up accruing to the professional services firms that can harness it. Because when we call lawyers, we still need an expert. When we call an accountant, we still need someone to sign the tax return. And there are all sorts of corner cases that represent the last 10% that you got to get right that require humans. But if you can automate, 90% of the work, I'm sure these professional services firms will be able to capture a good chunk of that.
Right. Right. If ultimately services have struggled with scalability past some stage, maybe in this world where you can take a ton of their, labor needs and put them onto platforms that make them more consistent and less requiring humans to do, like maybe all of a sudden services firms get bigger, or at least there's a consolidation. I think it's an interesting
That's
thing to
right.
watch.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's
And I
great.
was going to say the other one that I would say is like, I think a year from now will be much more top of mind, or more of what we're seeing is, I think, multimodality. Historically, a lot of what we've seen in this first year has been text-based. So ingesting documents, generating those documents, legal, insurance, etc. But I think as we talk about replacing human workflows, both those inside companies and outside, we humans we're multimodal. We see, we hear, we speak, we write, etc. We code. And I think that the ability, these models that are now natively multimodal, we're just going to see an explosion of a lot of these workflows that now tools can do on behalf of people because they have those end-to-end capabilities. And so I think we're really excited for a lot of those that are going to come out over the next year, and can tackle entirely new workflows, entirely new verticals.
Yeah, I agree. I sort of feel like the history of vertical SaaS is told like it was just some orderly clock ticking, where vertical after vertical adopted SaaS because they wanted to go to the cloud. I never saw a company that wanted to go to the cloud. Like they
Right.
don't care about the cloud. They cared about some specific utility that was delivered maybe initially for some by just being in the cloud so you could have remote access, but for others, it took the Android platform where you had a hardware device that encouraged you to finally couple that with software to go to the cloud, or embedded payments or other embedded financial tools. And here we are on the cusp of this multimodality, Katie, you referenced, where I think there's going to be three or four more miraculous magic tricks in the bag of cloud software that will allow them to take down more and more vertical applications. And so I do think
Yeah.
there's a reason we
Yeah, have
are
we
as
talked about a
excited
bridge?
about vertical software as we've ever been. And boy, we've been excited about vertical software for a decade. So for us to peak this late in the game is surprising.
Yeah, Brian,
Ken,
I
have
was
you
going to say
talked
like
about a
a bridge or
bridge
Rilla.
in any of your other interviews?
We cite them in the report, but hit us.
I mean, there's what's the expression? AI is whatever doesn't work yet. Like in its end state, you don't care about the LLMs, you don't care about the AI. It's just a magical solution. And so a bridge is truly magical. It may not be magical for us, but if you ask any doctor using a bridge, it has changed their life.
A
Because what
bridge
it
sits in
does,
their appointment with patients, takes the
a
notes
bridge
for them.
sits on their phone, they hit a button, it records all their patient conversations throughout the day, it summarizes them, it transcribes them, it inputs the medical information from those conversations into the EMR system. Doctors historically have done that manually, either themselves or using third-party scribes, and that process takes hours of work each day. They don't get paid to do that work. It's like the least fun part of their job. It pulls them away from patients because instead of looking the patient in the eye, they're sitting there typing into an EMR. It's the worst part of every doctor's day, and a bridge has just automated it away. It's win-win-win for everyone. The doctors love it, the patients get a better experience, and the hospitals love it because they get better data into their EMR system for billing purposes. So it's just magic.
Yeah. Now we just need a version of that for VC podcasts so we can all stop wasting time doing
Yeah,
stuff like this.
maybe the last thing that I'll add is I think the other reason that multimodality is really powerful in vertical markets is because there's a lot of data that is via voice or video or other modalities outside of text. And I think Rilla Voice in our portfolio is a really good example of this, where field sales reps historically had these conversations, but they were never transcribed. And so that data, it just lived in the ether. It was never actually captured. And thanks to, voice and a lot of the LLMs that are now better able to transcribe audio, capture it, generate audio, etc. Now all of a sudden this is completely new proprietary data that is being captured and brought online in a way that we weren't able to before. And so then I think that creates some real defensibility. And I think that's just one example of a place where a new modality is going to unlock new vertical data and new vertical use cases.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all for all this. Let's gather back here in a year and figure out how stupid we were about half of this and how right we were about the other half. And